last year or so, whenever I do a talk, I open with this greeting, Kasirian Ingera. This is the traditional greeting of the Maasai warriors, one of the fiercest and most intelligent of the tribes of Africa. And if you translate it literally, it means, and how are the children? For the Maasai, it's understood that the well-being of society is inextricably linked to the well-being of their children. Life is good when even the youngest and most vulnerable of the tribe are cared for. And it's kind of an interesting contrast to what we see in our culture. I think it was a Globe and Mail columnist that said the most typical question that we ask upon greeting is, what do you do for a living? Our priorities are slightly different. And I asked the question, how are our children? We know, for example, that 1 in every 5 youth, about 20% of our children are estimated to have significant mental health problems that warrant social services of some kind. And across schools, on average, about 6 to 12% of our children tell us that they don't feel safe in school, a place where they're mandated by law to attend. And also, on average, about 8 to 10% of our students tell us that they're bullied and harassed by peers on a daily or weekly basis, making school a very unpleasant place to be. Why all the attention now? Our concerns about school safety and bullying have increased drastically in the past decade. Despite evidence that youth violence in North America is actually on the decline, that less than 1% of teen-related gun deaths actually occur in schools, and that more than 99.9% of U.S. public schools have never had a homicide of any kind, the media has brought our attention to this issue. But interestingly, our attention is extremely recent, and this is true around the world. The earliest study of bullying was published as recently as 1969 in Scandinavia. Pioneering research by Dan Olweus in the 1970s provides a foundation for much of what we know and understand now about the problem. But it took a lot more for us to begin around the world to start addressing this problem. In late 1982, 3 10 to 14-year-old boys in northern Norway committed suicide, presumably as a result of bullying. The media attention given this event led to a nationwide campaign by the Ministry of Education starting in 1983. And as Marlene Snyder will tell us, it led to some good outcomes. Despite the tragedy. In Japan, it was in the early 1990s. The suicide death of a second grader named Hirofumi Shikagawa in 1986 brought public and legal attention to issues of bullying, but it was the suicide death of a fourth grade boy in 1994 that led the Ministry of Education to mandate extensive educational efforts to combat violence in the schools. In North America, we came to this a bit later. In 1999, most of us were stunned by news from Littleton, Colorado, where Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, 2 secondary students who were victimized and ridiculed by their mainstream peers, carried out a planned 3-hour revenge, murdering a teacher and 12 students and wounding 20 others before they took their own lives. The massacre at Columbine, a secondary school serving an affluent community, challenged many of our stereotypes about violence and peer harassment in the schools. After Columbine, we knew, without a doubt, that it could happen in any school and at any time. And we knew that the victims would fight back and could fight back with a vengeance. But Columbine was not the only tragedy. In March of 2001 in Santee, California, freshman Charles or Andy Williams, age 15, opened fire, wounding 15 and killing 2 in 6 minutes of shooting. He was a small kid, he was timid, he was constantly picked on, and even in his own group of skateboarders, he seemed to shrug it off. People didn't really know that it was bothering so much. When he was questioned after the shooting, his motive was, in fact, revenge. 2 days after that, Elizabeth Bush, a quiet 8th grade girl who actually wanted to be a nun or a human rights activist when she grew up, walked into the school cafeteria and shot one of the cheerleaders, presumably because she'd betrayed her by revealing secrets, and this had happened before. A study released by the U.S. Secret Service in the fall of 2000 indicated that two-thirds of the 37 school shootings that occurred since 1974 had attackers who had felt persecuted, bullied, threatened, or injured by their peers. But aggression and revenge is not the only response. In 1994, in Ottawa High School near Atlanta, 15-year-old Brian Head, an overweight sophomore, harassed about his weight, walked into his economics class, put a gun to his head and said, "I can't take it anymore," and he pulled the trigger. Living in Canada gives you a slightly different perspective on the United States, and it would be very easy for Canadians to say, gee, that happens south of the border. After all, you guys have different gun laws than us. But we can't do that where I live in British Columbia. In 1997, a 14-year-old girl named Rena Burke was brutally tortured for about an hour by 6 girls and a boy, and then left to die when one of the girls, Kelly Eller, came back and held head under the water with her foot and drowned her. Presumably, her crime was that she'd spread rumors about another girl. Hamid Nasto in 1999 filled his backpack with rocks and jumped from the Patella Bridge just outside of Vancouver, tired of being harassed by peers who called him a fag. 8 months after that, Dawn Marie Wesley hung herself with a dog leash in her home. She was threatened by 3 girls in her class repeatedly. One of them told her she was dead meat. She was afraid she was going to be tortured like Rena Burke. She'd heard the story and decided she'd rather take her own life, and so she did. And her case was particularly important for BC because the mother realized that these girls did not feel that what they had done was wrong. They really didn't feel it was their fault. So the mother pressed charges, and in a landmark ruling, 2 of the girls were found guilty. This led us to do some research to see whether kids really understood that the kinds of offenses they do in bullying are in fact criminal offenses if they were adults. What we found in our surveys is that actually only 62 to 75% of secondary students in our province, where it was a major public attention, agreed that bullying behaviors were actually criminal offenses. They do not realize that what these things are assault, extortion, slander, threats.